or within that same year.
Word. There we go.
Perfect.
All right. Well, Maggie, should we start with maybe an introduction? You tell us a little bit about yourself and your program that you developed. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was a school teacher back in the early 70s, and I worked with a lot of kids in the inner city, and they were pretty traumatized. And I realized that I really liked helping the kids and figure out what was making them tick more than I liked teaching spelling and phonics. So I ended up going back to school, and I became a school psychologist and a marriage family therapist uh, within 1 year of each other.
Wow.
I think more important than that is my what I call my pre and post embodiment, which I'm going to do a TED talk about. It's like
Oh,
when I was younger, I did all the right things, and I always did well in school and got straight A's and all of that. But I never felt like life was worth living, even if I had a boyfriend that was really cool and, everything I had wanted. And I didn't understand why. I had good enough parents. Everybody has problems with their families, but mine weren't horrendous or terrible. Um, and then I discovered Jack Cornfield. I don't know if you know about him. He's one of the premier Vipassana teachers who brought he's the founder of Spirit Rock, and he brought Ayurvedic meditation, which is an embodied meditation rather than transcendental where you leave your body, but helping people to come in to their oceanic fluids of their body. And I went on a retreat with him in Joshua Tree, and the retreat was we did meditation, but it was walking, bouldering, eating, all silently, and noticing the sensations that arose inside of us. And I felt really different afterwards and differently. And then I met Peter Levine shortly after that, took an introduction, because I was always in search of somatic therapies. And I had taken a body dynamic training with Lisbeth Marker from Denmark in developmental somatic psychotherapy. And somebody in the class said, if you like this, you should meet Peter Levine, and I'll bring him to La Jolla if you would like, if we have enough people from the class interested. And so I went to an introduction, and he called me up to do a demonstration, and it changed my life. It really, between the embodiment from Jack Cornfield, where I learned how to feel each boulder and taste each flavor when we were eating silently, and just slow down and feel every little nuance of sensation. And then with Peter, I felt my whole body shake and tremble and release some trauma and stress that I didn't even know I was holding. And it
wow.
was more than that. It was existential, because our right to be here. It was after the Northridge earthquake. You might be too young to remember that, but I live in Long Beach, and we felt it even here where I live. And Peter asked, was anybody in the recent earthquake? Because he came right after the earthquake, the same month. And I said, well, yeah, but it didn't even crack the plaster in my house. I just felt it. He said, you come up. And I said, oh, it was no big deal. I don't have any stress or trauma from it. And he said, come on up. And I came up, and he had me notice what I was feeling. And all of a sudden, I just started shaking wildly, and tears came, and I realized that I had birth trauma, and it went all the way back to my early existence. It's like when Mother Earth shakes, it wakes up something in us, called our own existential angst, or curiosity about our life, what it means to be here on this earth, and who we are and what we feel. And so I ended up taking his program. I had actually also taken with Francine Shapiro, I had taken the EMDR introduction. And after taking Peter's introduction, it was like, no contest. No, I'm definitely taking the 3-year training with Peter. I'm not going to take the training with Francine, because one was so much more organic. It like worked with each individual's nervous system rather than going with a set protocol this step first, then this step. I've never been a linear thinker. I always think outside the box, and my thinking is more uh, creative, like the spoke on a wheel with ideas here and here that move out from each other rather than A, B, C, D, E. Even though I can take great notes in that format, that's not who I am. That's not how my mind works. So I studied with Peter. I had already been a successful psychotherapist. I had studied Gestalt and was a Gestalt humanistic psychotherapist. And I did a pretty good job with most people. But there were some people I knew there was something missing in my training that I couldn't quite know what to do to help them more. And when I took Peter's training, it became very clear that it was physiological, not psychological, that there was trauma is stuck in the reptilian part of the brain, the fight, flight, or freeze portion in our lower brain that regulates everything, our breathing, our temperature, our heart rate. It regulates our endocrine system and our immune system. And if that's not right, then our psychology, our thinking's not going to be right. So after those two experiences with Peter, and then with with Jack, I think it was the year before or within that same year, I realized what it was like to be fully human, and that I had been walking around really one-dimensional instead of three-dimensional. And then I realized that why people wanted to live to an old age. I never understood, because I had a lot of aches and pains when I was young, and I had a lot of fatigue. And I thought, I do everything well, but I'm always tired, and I just don't feel like I have the stamina other people do. Why would anybody want to live to be 80 or 90 or 100? And then after that, I realized that I understood why life was so valuable and joyful, and I became a joyful person. So it changed my life, literally, and then it changed the life of my clients. And then Peter had asked me, he knew that I work with children, and he asked me if I could write the books. The first one was Trauma Proofing Your Kid Through a Child's Eyes. Do you have that one? Or do you have the new book? You have the new book,
I
my
have
book?
I have the new book. I have your new book, because
Yeah.
that's specific to what our senior project is.
Oh, good. So
School.
I worked in the schools. I was a school psychologist. I was a teacher, and I taught. Actually, my first teaching job was in Alaska, teaching high school English and drama. And then I came down to California. I was married in Alaska, and then had a baby, and went back to Cal State Long Beach to get my teaching credential. And I also became a school psychologist, and I worked every level from preschool assessment. You get them at 2 years, 10 months, when they're done with the county and they're ready to start public school, special needs children, all the way to emotionally disturbed and regular teenagers, high school kids. So I became intrigued, and I don't know if you know much about Long Beach. I don't know where you're from. Are you from California?
I'm actually from Chicago. I
Okay.
used to live in Santa Barbara when I was younger, but I'm not too
Well,
familiar.
lucky you. And you're from California?
Yeah, I grew up in like the Sacramento foothill area, so just right between Sac and Tahoe.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, in the 70s, when I was teaching, we had a lot of refugees. First, they were from Central America and Mexico. And the gangs were really starting up then. But then all of a sudden, we had a flood of Cambodian children. Long Beach is really the Cambodian capital. We have more Cambodians here than any place else in the world, except for Cambodia itself. And also we had Vietnamese, and mostly Cambodians. The Vietnamese seemed to settle more in Orange County. So these kids had so much trauma in their systems. And I left the schools. I took a leave of absence, and then I decided to resign because Peter had asked me to assist him all over the world. So I was really privileged
Wow.
to be on his coattails. And one time we had a tragedy at one of my schools, and Peter happened to be in town. I hadn't even finished the training yet. And I asked Peter if he would come with me, because they wanted me to work with the whole school. And it was a whole school crisis. And Peter said yes. And he saw the way I work with kids. I saw the way he worked with kids. And then after that, when the Germans invited him to write a book for children, he said, Mags, I don't have the time. You work with kids more than I do. Would you write the book? So I wrote Trauma Through a Child's Eyes. And I left the schools, I resigned, and then I went back because I needed to work with kids. It's not just in my private practice. I wanted to see how somatic experiencing really worked with kids in the schools that didn't have parents, that were being raised maybe by a sick invalid grandmother who could hardly get out of bed in the morning. And I wanted to see with those kids, would it be just as effective as with kids whose parents were paying, for my services and bringing them. And I found it was just as effective. It didn't make any difference to socioeconomics or whether the kids had parents or not. I mean, it does in some ways if they have to live with the parents, but if they don't have parents, you can work with the kids because you're working with their physiology. And so I went back for about 4 or 5 more years. And the kids that I talk about, the case studies, actually, this book was written not because I wanted to, but because North Atlantic called me. And so we get so many calls about the chapter you wrote in your first book,
Oh, wow.
Trauma Through a Child's Eyes. There's a 45-page chapter that's all case studies of the kids I worked with in the schools. You should read that, really, Trauma Through a Child's Eyes. It's they want more for educators. So would you write a book for educators? And I thought, oh shit, because I knew if I did that, it had to be evidence-based and I had to do a lot of research. So this book is loaded with research, most of it which comes out of the meditation community, working with the part of the brain that really supports empathy and kindness and compassion, which is the anterior insula, which is a very important part of the brain that connects the neocortex or the thinking brain structures with the midbrain and lower brain structures. It makes it possible to have whole brain intelligence, which is what we need because people are so fragmented now, right? Their thoughts and their emotions are contradicting each other and their physiology's off and they're stressed out. People basically are stressed out. So I went back and used it, and then I retired. And then I was asked to write this book, but I had already been developing what I call my play shops. Before I even knew what innovative psychotherapy was or what conscious connections meant, before I even studied attachment work, I had named my psychotherapy practice in the 80s, Conscious Connections. I've been a therapist since the 80s, right? Since the early 80s or mid 80s, I guess. And so I called it Conscious Connections. And so that's the name of my company, Conscious Connections Psychotherapy, but I have Conscious Connections Play Shop because Peter had asked me to be one of his first faculty members, and I started teaching somatic experiencing all over the US. I started the trainings in Texas and in Orange County and San Diego, Santa Barbara. I started them all over the place, San Francisco, and then on the East Coast, and then all over the world. I was asked to come and bring somatic experiencing to Asia and to Australia. I actually brought it to those continents.
Wow.
And in Europe, I decided not to say no and only to do work for kids, because my students all over the world were saying, somatic experiencing is phenomenal. It changed my life. I have a whole new lens. But how do you do this with children? How do you do this with babies? How do you do it with teenagers who don't want to come? How do you do it with 10-year-olds? So I got myself a video camera and I started filming. I didn't do many. My camera broke and the microphone wasn't very good. And I wasn't good at filming, but I filmed a few kids, some of the first ones that I was experimenting doing SE with kids. And oh my God, it was like, this is amazing. It's amazing. It's so easy to work with kids and they heal in a few sessions. And, this is great stuff. So I started teaching it. I put together a program and I taught all kinds of stuff, games and and a lot of art activities for pendulation. I don't know if you know the concepts from SE, like titration and pendulation. I don't know what you know from your mom.